All right, I want to start with this is lecture 2, part 3. This is unit 2 and 3. We are moving from the end of unit 2 into unit 3 today. I want to start with the schedule for this week. Notice that you have two major assignments due. First assignment is your journal number 6, and then your second assignment allows for some choice. So when we're looking at your schedule, Monday you're going to watch the lecture. Tuesday you have the readings to do. Remember those first ones that say a number and a letter come from ushistory.org. And then the last two titles there are the PDFs that are listed in Teams. Wednesday we have our online class. Thursday you have a choice of which assignment you would like to do. You are going to read both. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. You are going to read both Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. Your choice comes from which evaluation would you like to do. You can do the evaluation on Common Sense or you can do the evaluation on the Declaration of Independence. You choose. That is your second assignment of the week. Both your journal and your evaluation is due by Friday at midnight. Notice that you also have an exam this week. Your exam is going to be the same as last time. It will open up in a form at 8 a.m. and it will close at 11:45 because forms doesn't allow for an 11:59 ending on Friday. And that's the same format as your last test. There's 30 multiple choice that are worth 1.5 points apiece, and there is one extended response out of 5 points. You will have your study guide that you can find both in Teams and as an attachment in your This Week in U.S. History email that will help you prepare for the exam. Make sure you look that over. Any questions on the assignments, what you're supposed to be doing, how you're supposed to be doing it, please make sure you email me and I will do my best to answer those questions, or we can set a time to meet. Okay, let's move right in. We are going to do section 6 and 7 this week. This week is all about war. We are starting with the French and Indian War, and we are going to move right into the American Revolutionary War. So, we need to start with a little bit of a reflection on who else is in the North American territory. It was not just the English who were there. Oftentimes, when we study the beginning of U.S. history, we look at the 13 colonies and what colonial developments were there, but we don't often look past that. I want us to first start with this map here and focus on the different claims. So if we look at the blue, those are the claims of the French. If we look at the red, those are the claims of the British. If we look at the orange brownish color, those are the claims of the Spanish. Notice that there is some overlap. What overlap I want us to look at is the overlap between the French and the British, which is that striped area of the red and blue. So, when we look at New France, a little bit of background, there's going to be no religious freedom there, no self rule. Decisions within those territories are going to be made by the magistrates, which can kind of parallel the royal governors within the colonies. The land is much more vast, going from Newfoundland all the way through the Great Lakes down to the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. That is a lot of territory to cover, and the British are going to be looking at that territory and seeing the kind of lucrative businesses that are there. One, the Mississippi River, that is huge. Trade at this time. We're not using trains, we're not using cars, we don't have airplanes. You need to trade, and the fastest way to do so would be on those rivers. The Gulf of Mexico would be a huge trading port that we want to have access to and control. What is also in this territory is going to be the extremely lucrative fur trade. And where we see that taking place is going to especially be in the Ohio River Valley, which is going to be that area on the other side of the Carolinas, on the other side of Virginia, that striped area that you see there. Now, within that fur trade, there is going to be the opportunity to trade with the Native Americans. The fur trade is going to be unique to the colonies, not going to be something that can really come out of Europe. So, England is going to look to want to have full access to what the French have access to. So, the spark of the French and Indian War is going to take place in the Ohio River Valley when a squadron of soldiers are going to be led by a very young and at the time unknown 22-year-old George Washington, who is sent directed to attack the French at their stronghold under the name of Fort Duquesne. Soon after that attack, the Washington troops are going to have to surrender. So we see this meeting of Washington and the French. Washington surrenders, and then there is going to be another clash shortly after of a second wave of British force, which is also met with defeat. Now, what's important here is not who won and who took what. It is that the conflict began, because when the conflict between the British and the colonists who are fighting against the French in the Ohio River Valley, that news, when it travels to London, war is going to be declared from the British on the French, and that war is going to be fought over in Europe, which there it's called the 7 Years' War, and over in the colonies known as the French and Indian War. Why is it called the French and Indian War? Well, because the Native Americans, before the war, had been kind of the middleman, trading with both the British and the French, getting what they need from both sides. But once the war begins, the Native Americans are going to side with the French. So we will be fighting against the French and Indians, which is why we call it the French and Indian War. A name to note is William Pitt is going to serve as the British Secretary of State, having to deal in the conflict both at home and abroad. So what do we need to know the highlights of the French and Indian War? First and foremost, George Washington makes a name for himself. He is going to come out of this having a little bit more clout when it comes to a leadership role in the colonies. George Washington is going to be a colonel in the British Army. He is going to be recognized as a leader in the colony, and this is going to establish his role not only in the French and Indian War, but in the Revolutionary War and leading up to the Revolution and following the Revolution. So this is where George Washington starts to take on some of that fame and recognition within the colonies. The French and Indian War is going to result in a British victory. The British are going to have to make some peace agreements following the war, and that peace agreement is going to come from the Treaty of Paris. What happens within the Treaty of Paris is the French are going to give up all claims to any territory in North America. So I want us to look at the map that is there. On the left, the picture that has the blue, red, and green is going to be pre-Treaty of Paris. So you can see that the French has quite a bit of territory that they used to have claim to within North America. The Treaty of Paris takes away that claim, and you can see the results of that in the picture next to it, where France is gone because they had to give up all claims to any territory in North America. The new boundary for the British holdings in North America becomes the Mississippi River. And now, what happens here is the colonists are going to look to that territory and say, well, if the British have control of that territory, we should be able to move there. You got to think the colonists are growing. It has been some time now since they were established. Populations are growing, and when populations grow, people want more land to live in. So the colonists are going to look to the west and want to expand. The issue then becomes there are Native Americans on the other side of that territory that was just gained by the British. It's not completely empty. Just because the land isn't claimed by the French anymore, it doesn't mean that there aren't still people there. So there are still people within that territory. It's just supposed to belong to the British. So, in order to protect the colonists, to prevent conflicts, further conflicts with the Native Americans, the Proclamation Line of 1763 is going to be established. The Proclamation Line is going to follow the geographic feature of the Appalachian Mountains, and the whole purpose of the Proclamation Line is to prevent the colonists from moving westward and to prevent further conflict. Now, think about this. If I had you guys in the classroom right now, and let's say you're sitting in your desks and all of a sudden I have to leave. I say, nobody's going to be able to come in. They can't get a sub for me. You guys just sit here, stay here until the 3 o'clock bell rings, don't move. And I leave and nobody's watching you. Are you going to sit in your desk? Probably not. You're going to get up, you're going to move, you're going to need to do what you got to do. And that's what the colonists are thinking. They say, okay, well, if there's no consequence and nobody's here standing at this line and pushing us back, then why should we have to follow it? Yes, the Appalachian Mountains are there as a geographic feature, but that's not an end-all be-all. We can still move past that. And the colonists are going to test their luck here when the proclamation line is established. The other important piece that we need to start to be aware of is when the proclamation line is established, this is one of the first times that the British are going to try to direct the colonists in what they can and cannot do. And remember from the last lecture, we called that policy before where the British and the crown were just kind of turning their back on the king, salutary neglect. The proclamation line, it doesn't sound like they're ignoring the colonists anymore. It in fact sounds like we're trying to exercise a little power over the colonies. And the colonists aren't going to like that, not one bit. The impact of the war. Just because the British win the war doesn't mean that everything is good, everything is fine, we just move forward, everything's the same. It in fact means that we are going to see an increased British presence following the war. If there was one conflict with the French, if there was one conflict with the Native Americans, there could be more to come. And the British ultimately were fighting the French and Indian War to protect their holdings in North America. They didn't want to lose the colonies. They didn't want that money that the colonists are making them to be threatened. So the British, to prevent and try to put off any more further conflicts between the colonists and the Native Americans or anybody else who could attack them, are going to increase their presence. That presence looks like soldiers on the ground. That means that more British officials are in the colonies, more power to the royal governors, just more of a presence, which of course the colonists are not going to like because they're not used to it. It wasn't like that before. And there is going to be a push to control the growth of the colonies. Like I said, the proclamation line there was to prevent the colonies from moving into the new lands. And they are going to try to prevent that with the British presence. Another impact of the war is a sense of colonial unification. Okay, so when we look at colonial unification, this idea of nationalism, the colonists are pretty proud of themselves in seeing the defeat of the French and the Native Americans. It pushes forward that idea of we together can do this. It also pushes them towards unifying against the British force. It's not just one colony that wants to spread west. There are many different colonists in many of the different colonies that want to expand, that want to push further. And this idea of we together have this idea, we together can accomplish this, starts to unify the colonies as well. We're also going to see a period at the end of salutary neglect, salutary or benign neglect. So, the French and Indian War, when it's fought in the name of protecting the colonists, protecting the holdings of the British in North America, that idea gets used against the colonies moving forward. That war was not cheap. In fact, it was very expensive. And how does the government pay back debt? Well, it collects money from the people. So, in order to pay back that very expensive debt that was accrued because of the French and Indian War, taxes are going to be set on the colonies. And that ends that period of salutary neglect where the colonists could kind of do what they needed to do. It's not that they weren't having to pay any taxes to the British, it's just that they weren't having to pay very much taxes to the British, and there wasn't too much control in what they were trading, how they were trading. But all of that starts to come to an end, and the French and Indian War is an extreme turning point in this relationship between the colonists and the British, because before the French and Indian War was a period of salutary neglect, full of self-government, full of making decisions and laws in trade, and kind of being able to do their own thing. Post French and Indian War, we are going to see a very different tone in the colonies. So, we are going to begin with the writs of assistance. Now, we need to know what a writ of assistance is. A writ is the ability to search ships for the possibility of smuggling, and if those smugglers were found, they were then to be thrown in jail with no trial. So, what is smuggling? Smuggling is when you are bringing in contraband goods to the country. And at this point in time, colonists were pretty well known as smugglers. What they would like to do is bring in goods from maybe competing empires that they didn't have to pay taxes on. They'd smuggle it in. So, how could it be taxed if nobody knew it was coming in? And once those goods were in the colonies, they would sell them for a cheaper price. One, because they weren't paying taxes on it, and two, if you want to make money, you sell your good at the lowest price that you can, and more people will buy from you. So smuggling was an incredibly lucrative business in the colonies, but that was not good for the British Crown. So when we see writs of assistance start coming up under the Sugar Act, this idea of smuggling is going to start to be threatened, which the colonists were making money smuggling. They don't like it when that money's taken away. The Sugar Act, what we need to look at here is the Sugar Act actually lowered the tax on molasses. But what it put into place, and this goes back to the writs of assistance, were smugglers' courts. So we would see smugglers being prosecuted. We would see smugglers being thrown in jail. There was an increased presence of customs officials to search the ships coming into the colonies under the Sugar Act, and that's the problem that the colonists had with it. It wasn't the tax, it was the fact that their smuggling business was now in jeopardy. And this is the British flexing their muscle on the colonies, saying, you know, that behavior that may have been okay under the period of salutary neglect before the French and Indian War? Well, now it's not, because we need money to pay for that war that we just had to do to protect you. and this is the way we're going to do it. The Stamp Act is going to be passed next in 1765, and this is going to be a tax on all printed materials. Now, printed materials included legal documents. So, what are legal documents? Well, those are land deeds, those are wills, those are marriage license, birth certificates, death certificates, contracts of any sort. All of these contracts would not be recognized as legal in a court of law unless they were prepared on specific paper where the Stamp Act, the stamp tax, would be paid for. In addition to these legal documents, newspapers, dice, playing cards, they all were covered under the stamp tax. They had to be, a tax had to be paid on these goods, which were very common throughout the colonies, in order for the colonists to purchase them. Now, this is going to be a problem because the direct tax on the colonies is going to affect all classes of colonists. It's going to go after the wealthy with those with the legal documents. It's going to go after the maybe lower class with the playing cards. So all of these goods hit all of the colonists across the board. So the Stamp Act is going to be highly controversial in the colonies. The next piece that's going to be passed is the Quartering Act. Now, when we look at that word there, I want you to think of if somebody said to you, these are your living quarters. So that's going to describe where you live, where you stay, the roof over your head. The Quartering Act is going to require colonists to house the British troops that were stationed in the colonies following the French and Indian War. Remember, I said we have an increased British presence because they want to prevent any further conflict with the Native Americans, and they want to keep an eye on the colonists. Well, they need somewhere to live. And the British are going to order the colonists to house these people. And when they order them to house these people, they aren't going to provide any compensation for it. Instead, they're going to tell the colonists, you don't have a choice. You have to do this. You are going to house these troops, and you're going to feed them. You're going to give them a place to live. You're going to essentially foot the bill to take care of these colonists. And you don't have a choice, because if you don't do it, you're breaking the law. So the Quartering Act is going to further anger the colonists, because who really wants to give up their food and their housing to people that they didn't want there in the first place? The redcoats, these officials, are going to represent everything that the colonists don't like. And what idea then comes up after we start seeing the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act being passed is this idea of no taxation without representation. This idea goes all the way back to the Magna Carta that we had talked about before. Remember, the Magna Carta was passed to limit the power of the king by stating that the king could not just tax the people without their consent. That consent had to come from Parliament, those representatives of the people. Well, within Parliament, there were no representatives for the colonists. So the colonists know this. They're very well aware of it. And the argument is going to begin that without representation, direct representation in Parliament, the taxes could not stand. Parliament is going to come back and say, well, you have virtual representation here. And that virtual representation is where we consider what you're thinking, what you're feeling. We talk about you. We recognize the plights of the colonists. And we are really keeping your best interest in mind. But that isn't going to fly. The colonists aren't going to just accept that idea. So, the Declaratory Act is going to be proclaimed by Parliament. And what this states is Parliament declares that they have the power, they have the right to have the authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever, whatever they think is fit. this phrasing of the act was intentionally vague, was intentionally unambiguous because they wanted it to cover everything. Parliament wanted to say, we have the power to do whatever we want, whenever we want, and you colonists just have to deal with it. And that's what the Declaratory Act is stating. Now, the colonists are going to push back against the Stamp Act to the point where it is removed, it is repealed. And with the Stamp Act being gone, money still needed to be collected. That money that's being collected from the Stamp Act, when it goes away, they need to make up for the to cover the debt still. The debt didn't go away just because the Stamp Act did. So the Townshend Act is going to be passed. The Townshend Act is passed by Charles Townshend, who was the chief financial officer over in England. He had control over the money in England, collecting the taxes, setting the taxes. His job was really to figure out how the heck do we pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. The Townshend Act is going to be the first indirect tax on the colonies. And what that means is these taxes are going to be placed on merchants, and those merchants are going to have to raise prices of goods to pay the tax that's put on them. When the Townshend Act is passed, it's passed on everyday goods like lead, paint, paper, glass, and tea. And these are goods that everybody uses in all of the colonies every day. That's going to further anger the colonists. And they're going to get so angry that we are going to see the Boston Massacre. On March 5th, 1770, a mob of angry townspeople are going to descend upon a guard at a customs house. Customs being where they're keeping the money collected in taxes in customs. And when these people see the guard there, who is a British representative, they're going to get angry. They're going to start throwing rocks and snowballs and yelling and pushing, and this mob mentality is going to grow. And in the heat of the confusion, the British are going to fire without any consent or command from the captain. And as the Imperial bullets are fired into the crowd, 5 men are going to lose their life, including Crispus Attucks, who was a former slave. Many others are going to be injured, but only 5 will die. Now, I know that I'm saying only 5, but when we look at the title Boston Massacre and we look at that picture there that is going to be spread throughout the colonies, produced by Paul Revere, this is really going to push the colonists to get angry. They're going to want to avenge the lives of the people lost in the Boston Massacre. And it's used as a piece of propaganda in the colonies to inspire them to move forward. Now, what we're also going to see is some retaliation against the tea tax. Now, when we look at what's going on here, we have to look first back at the British East India Company. The British East India Company had been given full rights to trade within the colonies, so they had, in a sense, a monopoly on the tea within the colonies. The Tea Act allows for that monopoly to happen. So the British East India Company is profiting heavily on the selling of tea that is heavily taxed in the colonies. The colonists love their tea, but they hate the tax. So what we are going to see is the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is meant to protest the tea tax against the colonists, and what they do is they dress up in the middle of the night like Mohawk Indians, led by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, onto the ships in the Boston Harbor, and they dump the tea into the harbor. Millions and millions of dollars in today's money into the Boston Harbor. Now, as you can imagine, the British, the Crown, not happy in the slightest about this action, and what we see in retaliation to those actions is the intolerable acts being passed. The other name of the intolerable acts that sometimes we see is the coercive acts. Now, I want to focus on that word intolerable because what we are saying here is that the British will no longer tolerate the behavior of the colonists, such as what they've seen at the Boston Tea Party. What these acts do is they shut down the Boston Harbor until all of the money for the tea that was dumped is paid back. And this increases a British presence yet again within the colonies, and this further angers the colonists. And what we are going to see at this time is a reassertion of the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts are going to say you can only trade British ships, British sailors, and British goods. And again, that's going to anger the colonists because they've gotten so used to having some say over what they trade. They have that lucrative smuggling business, and the Navigation Acts and the Intolerable Acts are going to take that away. Some notable figures that we need to look at. First of all, when we see the word patriot, we are talking about people who want to break away from England. We are going to see groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty be formed, which is a part of your reading, so I'm not going to go super in depth here, but a name to remember, our names to remember are Samuel and John Adams. Another notable figure, John Hancock, who was one of the richest men in the colonies due to his smuggling business, and Paul Revere. I know you know that name from The British Are Coming. The British Are Coming when we get closer to the Revolution here in a second. But he was a silversmith and an artist who produced that etching that we just saw of the Boston Massacre. I want to draw your attention for just 1 second to the join or die snake that we see there. This snake was originally used for the Albany Plan of Union that we talked about in the last lecture, but it's going to come back up during this time of moving closer to the Revolution as an idea again to the colonists that separately we are nothing, together we are strong. So that idea of we need to unite to push against the crown is going to come back up. The Daughters of Liberty you're going to read about, and pay special attention to the role of women and how much power they really did wield under this this time of pushing, being these radical figures. Now, I could go super in depth here, but I just want to say the Sons and Daughters of Liberty are going to be radical groups within the colonies that, had the revolution gone a different way, could have faced severe consequences for being a radical group. All right, section 7. We are going to look at a reaction to the taxes. We're going to swoop right in the Declaration of Independence. Don't forget that's one of your readings. And we're going to real quick blow through the Revolution and some revolutionary thoughts. Continuing on with the reaction to the taxes, the Stamp Act Congress is going to be convened in New York in October of 1765. Representatives from 9 of the colonies are going to come to frame a set of resolutions of rights and grievances and to petition the king and parliament to get rid of the taxes. What they want is the taxes to go away. But the biggest thing that we need to know here is that the Stamp Act Congress was, of course, going against the Stamp Act. And what it does is the colonists come together and decide that they are going to boycott. They are going to boycott goods from the British in order to stop that tax. And it works because the Stamp Act is going to be repealed, which is huge there. The boycotts show that the colonists are uniting together, and they are uniting under an idea that we can hurt the British if we work together. We all have to boycott. It doesn't matter if just one city does it, it matters if all the colonies do it. Another reaction to the taxes is going to be the committees of correspondence. The committees of correspondence is founded to be the spine of the colonial interaction. The Virginia House of Burgesses is going to follow the lead of John Adams, and they are going to establish this committee, which would be a standing committee that handles the discussions of the colonies. This is going to make the colonies band together. It is going to get them organized in one place at one time to again continue that idea. If we work together, then we will be effective. Together we will be successful. Apart we will fail. The First Continental Congress is going to take place in 1774. Delegates from 13 of the colonies, except for Georgia, who was fighting a Native American uprising, are going to meet in Philadelphia. Their goal here is to form and organize colonial resistance to the coercive acts. And what they start to do here is draft a declaration of colonial rights. They start to come up with this idea of these are the rights that we should have, these are the rights that are being violated, and these are the conditions that we want moving forward. So again, we're seeing from the Stamp Act Congress to the committees of correspondence to the First Continental Congress, this progression of we need to band together against this oppressive force. The Second Continental Congress is going to meet, and at the Second Continental Congress, you are going to see in May of 1775 the delegates from the different colonies meet in Philadelphia again. Here they are going to form the Continental Army, knowing that they are going to need to fight. And we're going to talk about why they feel they need to fight here in a second, but here you're going to see George Washington get the control, the command of the army. You're going to also see that the colonies authorize the printing of their own money, and we're going to see the writing of the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition is going to be a message from the colonies to the king. Now, if you get in a fight with somebody or an argument with somebody, you may try to establish an olive branch by apologizing or having an open dialogue. The Olive Branch Petition is exactly that, between the colonies and the king. What it says, though, is that the colonists don't want anything to do with Parliament because they fault Parliament for all of what is wrong in the colonies right now. They say those taxes, they're all Parliament's fault, and they pledge their allegiance to the king in the Olive Branch Petition, but really say we don't want anything to do with Parliament. The king rejects the Olive Branch Petition. So that idea that they were going to kind of be able to mend fences and move forward is blown out of the water when the king rejects the Olive Branch Petition and instead sends more troops to the colonies. Another important piece that you are going to read this week is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Thomas Paine is going to write the pamphlet of common sense to the people, stating that it is common sense that we should break away from England. This pamphlet is going to be written in plain language so that it can be mass distributed throughout the colonies and that the most people can read it, because the message that Paine is sending to challenge the authority of the British government and the royal monarch is incredibly important, and he wanted everybody to read it. What he's saying is there are two main parts of his argument. One, we need to declare independence from England, and two, we need to create a democratic republic in the colonies. Democratic meaning that we need the voice of the people within the government. Republic meaning it should be run by elected officials. And he says this idea is common sense because why are we allowing a small nation like England to rule over such a large continent where we are? He says it's dumb that we're letting this king thousands of miles away control us and force us into heavy taxes in a life that we don't want. Paine is going to be viewed as an extremist during this time. He's even going to say that the revolutionary thought within the colonies will spread like wildfire throughout the world. So, in a sense, he predicts the French Revolution in common sense. But people think he's nuts. They think he's crazy. There is no way that anyone could challenge the authority of a monarch. But it really pushes to where we go next, which is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is going to be written in part by Thomas Jefferson due to his experience and the finesse that he has from the worldly travel that he's done, the studying of other places. And this Declaration of Independence has three main parts. I like to think of the Declaration of Independence as one extremely long breakup text. It starts with the statement of intent. We are declaring independence. The second part is the list of grievances or the complaints that the colonists have against the king. And then the third part is to dissolve the ties between the colonists and the crown. Now, it is going to be passed with a 12-0 vote. New York is going to abstain from voting, and it is going to be start to be signed, I guess I should say, July 4th, 1776, and then approved by Congress. And it is going to advance the idea that all men are created equal, although we aren't really talking about all men yet. It is also going to put forth that all men, not all men, are born with unalienable rights. So, heavily influencing this document is going to be some of the names that we talked about last time, those Enlightenment thinkers, especially John Locke and the natural rights theory. You're going to see his hands all over the Declaration of Independence. I want to read you a quote, and we're going to look at this in our discussion on Wednesday. But the quote is, "But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evidences a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for the future security." What it's saying here is that when a people have been wronged, it is their right, it is their duty to overthrow the government and bring in a new one. And that's the main idea here. The colonists felt that they had been wronged. They need a new government. But with the Declaration of Independence being signed in 1776, that doesn't just mean that the colonists are free. What needs to happen next is they have to fight for their independence. When we look at the fighting for their independence, we have to look at the two sides that are fighting here. On one side, we have the British. On the other side, we have the colonists or the patriots. The British are going to have the advantage of that vast navy. Remember, the sun never sets on the British Empire, which inspired them to have this strong and vast navy in order to survive and protect all of their holdings. They are going to be well supplied. Think of all the industry that is in the British Empire right now. they can get whatever they want, however much they want. And they are well funded. They've got money. The colonists do have some advantages as well. They're going to have the advantage of home field, so they know the land. And they're also going to be fighting for their rights. That's huge when we think about what inspires somebody to fight. Being able to have something to sign your name to put your heart behind, that's what wins wars. So when we look at the other side, the British downfalls or weaknesses is going to be that they're pretty far from home, which takes away that connection to the fighting. There's also going to be that question of necessity. Do we really need to fight this war? Are the colonies really that important? So, and that can cause some faction within those that are fighting. Now, the weaknesses of the colonists: they are poorly supplied, they are poorly funded, they are heavily unorganized, and they are going to lack support. 1 in 5 colonists are going to be loyal to the crown. They are going to be what we call loyalists. So it's not that everybody in the colonies all at once said, yep, let's break away. Nope, they're going to have to get those colonists on their side and push for independence, because it is not a readily accepted idea. When we look at important battles of the Revolution, first we're going to have those at Lexington and Concord. At Lexington is going to begin with the redcoats coming to try to confiscate the stockpiled arms that the colonists had been putting together. As the taxes had been being raised, the colonists started to stockpile weapons like cannons, different artillery. They're going to start to try to organize the Minutemen, who were the militiamen who could get ready at a minute's notice to fight the revolution. At Lexington, the redcoats are going to come to confiscate those weapons. They are going to easily defeat the Patriots, which kind of put a blow to the morale of the Patriots at first. After the capture of big names like Sam Adams and John Hancock at Lexington, the Patriots are going to be a little bit down on themselves. The redcoats are going to move right on to Concord. These two battles, Lexington and Concord, happening right at the beginning, and that goal being to seize the supplies. At Concord, though, the Minutemen, who were named for their quick response when there was a call to soldiers, go ahead and make a strong blow to the British Army, killing over 200. So Concord is important because it shows that the British aren't just going to be easy victors here. The Patriots are going to put up some fight. Bunker Hill is another important battle that we need to look at. Bunker Hill was actually fought at Breed's Hill. They didn't know that they were on Breed's Hill, so they named it Bunker Hill. What we see here is that the Patriots had a tactical advantage of being on top of Breed's Hill. The Patriots had to protect that holding. The British are going to come up the hill and have to attack multiple times, which had they only attacked, maybe once, the Patriots would have been able to hold them off. But the Patriots at Bunker Hill, the only reason they lost was because of their lack of resources. And I love this quote here from William Prescott, who says, as the Patriots are defending their stance on top of Breed's Hill, being fought at Bunker Hill, supposedly, he says to them, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Let them get so close that you know that you will hit them." Because you gotta think, they're fighting with muskets. Not the most accurate. If you don't have a lot of supplies, you're going to want to wait to fire until they're close enough that you know that you're going to make a fatal blow. the Americans are going to lose, the Patriots are going to lose due to their lack of resources. The British are going to suffer a very heavy loss, though. We're going to see out of the 2,300 that are there, over 1,000 are going to be either killed or wounded, which again, Bunker Hill shows us that the Patriots aren't just going to fall over. They are going to put up a good fight. Of course, we are going to see battles along the way, but the most important, biggest turning point that we need to remember is Saratoga. Saratoga is going to be fought, and here we are going to see that the British are going to be extremely weakened at this point. The war has been going on for some time now, and the Patriots easily defeat the British. But the reason this is a turning point is because the Patriots are victorious, and with that victory, the French enter in on the side of the Patriots in the American Revolution. Before this point, the French had been supplying the Patriots covertly. They did not want to be open partners with the Patriots for fear that if the Patriots lost, they could face the wrath of the British Empire. But after Saratoga, seeing that the Patriots won and how easily defeated the English were, the French are going to enter on the side of the Patriots. Which brings us to our last slide of the day, where we see the ending of the revolution with Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. Cornwallis is going to surrender at Yorktown because he was surrounded by sea with the French Navy who had come to help the Patriots. He's going to be surrounded on land by the Patriots and the French. And with this, the French being there to seek retribution on an old enemy, Cornwallis is going to be forced to surrender, knowing that they will not defeat the French and the Patriots, which pushes us and signals an ending to the revolution. After Yorktown, the English are going to be more open to talking a peace agreement, which is going to be called the Treaty of Paris in 1783. This Treaty of Paris allows for American independence to be recognized, and it grants some pretty generous boundaries to the Americans. The new boundary for American independence now becomes the Mississippi River. The thing that we do need to remember is that in the Treaty of Paris, the French are going to be completely left out. They will not be brought to the table. They will not be compensated for their loyalty to the Patriots whatsoever. Also within this Treaty of Paris, the loyalists who had remained loyal to the crown up until the very end are prevented from coming home. The Patriots basically laugh in their face and say, "You didn't side with us throughout this war, so say goodbye. You don't belong here. You don't get to side with us just because we won. Take your king and be loyal to him now too." The Native Americans are kind of forgotten in all of this, as per the trend of history has been showing us, and they are left with no protection from the Patriots at this point, from the Americans at this point. Something that we do need to know is that the British didn't just disappear after the Revolution. They are going to remain, and we're going to see some of those problems in the beginning of the next unit. They will remain and have some of the forts, the strongholdings, which you can see in the map there, where those flags are, or where the British forts remain even after the Revolution comes to an end. Just because the revolution's over doesn't mean that everything is going to be perfect in the colonies. We have some pretty heavy decisions to make. What kind of a government will we have? How will we collect taxes? Will we collect taxes? And what kind of laws, if any, will we have? And that's exactly where we'll pick up at the beginning of the next unit. All right, don't forget you have your 2 assignments for this week. You have your journal and you have the evaluation on either the Declaration of Independence or Common Sense. And don't forget to do your readings and that your unit exam is going to be given on Friday. Again, any questions? Please email me.